All right, this is for Chapter 2. We're looking at majoritarian or pluralist democracy. This lecture will be brief. You'll still need to read the chapter and make sure you take good notes there. Your learning outcomes for this chapter are: number one, distinguish between the two theories of democratic government used in political science, procedural and substantive. Number two, compare and contrast the majoritarian and pluralist models of democracy. And number three, evaluate the challenges facing the countries trying to move toward a democratic form of government. All right, we're going to just kind of look at this. We have partisan differences over immigration. Partisan means referring to the party they belong to. Republicans, by majority of 60-something%, want to stop illegal immigration, and fewer than 40% want legal residency. Independents, it's fewer than 40% want to stop illegal immigration, close to 60% want legal residency, and the Democrats, between 20 and 30% want to stop illegal immigration, and around 70% want legal residencies. So this is just kind of an example of partisan differences over a policy. Okay. Now, the theory of democratic government. There were lots of ancient Greek philosophies, and if you look at the Greek city-states, you'll see that several of them were ruled by various different types of government. You had at one extreme of that an autocracy, which is where you have the power in the hands of a monarch. In modern times, an autocrat can also be a dictator of some sort. It doesn't necessarily have to be a monarch or a king, but you have all the power concentrated in the hands of one person. In an oligarchy, which was like what Sparta had, you had power in the hands of the elite. In other words, you have a certain group of people that controls the government. In Sparta, it was your military leaders. Egypt, for instance, has something of an oligarchy where they have a democratically elected government, but really the military controls it. In some places, it might be your business leaders or something like that, but it's just a few powerful people of whatever class that run the government. And then you have democracy, which is what Athens had. That's power in the hands of people, and they had a pure democracy. We'll talk more about the difference between that in just a moment. Now, democracy is something that originated with the Greek, and if you look at the origins of it, the word demos, part of the word demos means common people, kratos means power, so it means power of the people. Sometimes Greeks feared a democracy because they feared that there could be a demagogue that would kind of appeal to and deceive the masses by manipulating their emotions and their prejudices. There have been people like that throughout history who have been that way. I think Hitler would be a good example of a demagogue who appealed to people's emotions and deceived them to control them. And there are two schools of thought today: that the democracy is a form of government, and the other idea is that democracy is a procedural approach. In other words, how you get to the type of government you have, which leads us to the procedural view of democratic or democracy. In procedural democratic theory, this is a view of democracy as being embodied in a decision-making process that involves universal participation, political equality, majority rule, and responsiveness. In other words, they address three distinct questions: who should participate in decision-making, how much should each participant's vote count, and how many votes are needed to reach a decision. So basically, they look at the procedures. How does the government make its decisions? What are the procedures that are used to do that? And in procedural democratic theory, all adults should participate in government decision-making. Everyone within the boundaries of a political community should be allowed to vote. If some people, such as recent immigrants, are prohibited from participating, they are excluded only for practical or political reasons because they're not citizens or whatever. But the theory of democracy itself does not exclude any adults from participation. That theory is this idea of universal participation. The next idea is political equality. How much should each participant's vote count? Should everybody get one vote? Should all votes be counted equally, etc.? The third idea is majority rule. How many votes are needed to reach a decision? When we think of majority rule, we think of 50% of the vote plus one. So, for instance, in our electoral college, a majority of the electoral college is 270 votes. Half of it, 50%, is 269 plus one. So 270 votes is what it takes to win the presidency. That's majority rule. There are some times when there may be other alternatives about what the majority rule is going to be. For instance, in our own country, we have instances where it takes what you call a supermajority to make a decision, such as when approving an amendment to the Constitution. There are times when you have a plurality rule. So, for instance, in political campaigns, when 1992, when President Bill Clinton was running against President George H.W. Bush, H. Ross Perot was a third-party candidate who pulled quite a bit of the vote. In most states, no candidate received a majority of the vote. Bill Clinton received a plurality of the vote. In other words, he had more votes than anybody else, but not yet a majority, and he was still elected president. So there are times when a plurality may work. But in the procedural view of democracy, they look at how the procedures go to make something happen. Now, the question we then have to ask, if we're going to have a democracy, what kind of democracy do we have? Is it a direct democracy? Is it an indirect democracy? What's it going to be? In a participatory democracy, this is a system of government where rank and file citizens themselves, they rule themselves rather than electing representatives to govern on their behalf. A good example would be town meetings in New England. In many small towns in New England, they don't elect a mayor or a town council. They meet together, all the citizens in the town, or at least as many as want to, meet together on a regular basis, and then they vote on the decisions. This was a direct, pure democracy. This is what they have in many new towns in New England. This is what they had in Athens. And there are some places around the world where they have this. This is not very common, and it does not work very well on a large scale. The problem on a large scale is, can you imagine 330 million citizens in the United States trying to make a decision on everything the United States government has to decide? So we don't see it a lot, but that is direct democracy. An idea that's growing is this idea of e-government or electronic government. In Boston, for instance, they have a street bump thing, which is where you can go online and you can register opinions and complaints to government officials, and it allows them to be able to address those that way. So you're seeing much more of that, where citizens are able to connect with their government through electronic means, etc. Now, we also have what's called a representative democracy, or can also be called a republic. This is what our Constitution institutes. It's where we, the people, elect representatives to represent us and speak on our behalf. There is a lot of debate about how responsive our representatives should be. Is a representative there representing the will of the majority of the people, or do the people elect that person and then allow them to make their own decisions based on what they believe is right? There's a debate over that, and that's something we can look at some point in the future. But in the United States, we have a representative democracy, or I prefer the term republic. It's not a direct democracy. It's not a true democracy. It's a type of democracy where we elect representatives that represent us and vote on our behalf and rule on our behalf. We're going to skip that. There are 4 principles of procedural democracy. Universal participation, that every citizen should be allowed to vote. Political equality, that each vote should count the same. Majority rule, that the majority of the votes should count, and that government should be responsive to public opinion. This is what procedural democracy is all about, the procedures, and that government responds to public opinion. So if 53% of the opinion of the public wants something, government ought to do that. So that's the idea of this procedural democracy. It's not really what we have, but that's the idea behind it. Then we have what's known as the substantive view of democracy. This focuses on the substance of what's going on and not on procedures. Okay, so in the substantive view of democracy, I have lost my notes. Again, they focus on the substance, not the procedures. It is based on the Bill of Rights and the amendments. Government should guarantee civil liberties and civil rights. So in this idea, you might have majority rule, but minorities still receive their rights. So when I say minorities, I don't mean racial minorities or religious minorities. I mean people who are not voting with the 50% plus 1% of the population that are voting for something. So government should guarantee civil liberties and civil rights to everyone, regardless of whether they win the election or not. There are disagreements over what social rights should be guaranteed by government. Conservatives have a very narrow view. For instance, most conservatives don't believe in legalizing marijuana. Most conservatives don't believe in legalizing same-sex marriage and things like that. Liberals, on the other hand, have a much broader view. They mostly want to legalize marijuana. They mostly believe in the legalization of same-sex marriage, etc. So there are some differences, but the idea is that it's the substance, not the procedure of the democracy is what counts. Okay. We're going to go, oh, that's an interesting one. Is government responsible for healthcare? The green line says, yes, it's government's responsibility. The red says it's not. From about 1999 to about 2009, most people, a percentage of the people, said that government was responsible for healthcare. Starting around 2010, which was the passage of the Obamacare bill, it began to switch back and forth a little bit, and now we have a larger majority of people, or at least by 2013, a bigger percentage of the people that did not believe that government should be responsible for providing health care. And we can talk more about why that happened at some point in the future. Now, procedural democracy versus substantive democracy. In substantive democracy, there is no clear, precise criteria. They're focused on the substance, not how you get there. In procedural, you're focused more on the procedures and the rules, but it can also produce undesirable social policies. So, for instance, in procedural democracy, you might have a majority of people that want to outlaw something that a minority of people will then have taken away from them, and that might produce some undesirable social policies, and it may clash with minority rights. So you have to decide, do you want to choose the procedures or do you want to choose the policies? There has to be a compromise at some point, which is what I think we try to do in America, where we balance minority and majority interests. In other words, we let majority rule as much as possible, but we also allow for minority rights to be protected. Okay. In order for a democracy to work, there have to be certain institutional mechanisms required. You have to have elections. Political parties are not always fun, but I think they're very much necessary. You need legislatures, in other words, groups of people where they make the laws. You need interest groups that represent groups of people. You know, they have a bad name right now, but they're very important in our democracy. There are two models of democracy, majoritarian and pluralist. The majoritarian model of democracy says that we're going to rule by the government by majority of the people. We want the popular election of government officials, and we want these elections to decide government policies, whether by referendum. Referendum is when the people, the legislature passes a law, but then the people vote on whether it becomes a law. An initiative is where the people propose their own law, and then the people vote on it. A recall would be when the people don't like a mayor or a governor or something, and then they get enough signatures on a petition and then have a new election to recall that person. The critics of this say that Americans are not knowledgeable enough about politics and the details of what's going on, and I would say I probably tend to agree with that. The defenders of majoritarian model of democracy say that Americans have coherent opinions. This would be a more pure form of democracy than what we have created with our own Constitution. The pluralist model of democracy, however, is government by the people operating through competing interest groups. This is a shift from mass electorate to organized groups. The two major mechanisms of pluralist democracy are interest groups and decentralized government. Well, you remember our founders created a decentralized government. You have the federal government in Washington, D.C., but you also have 50 state governments plus the local governments in your counties and your cities and your towns and your school boards and your hospital boards and your water boards and things like that. Very decentralized government where people make decisions on a local level more so than on a national level. You also have interest groups that help people get their voice heard. For instance, I have a former student who works for the International Franchise Association in Washington, D.C., and he's an attorney, but the franchise is a business like McDonald's where you can buy your own McDonald's and you have the name, you have given the right to use the brand name and all that. but you actually own the business yourself. Well, the International Franchise Organization represents them, these franchise owners in DC to the government. So he actually meets with Congress people and helps pass laws and write laws and things like that to help get their voice heard in DC, especially when laws are being passed. There are all kinds of interest groups. There are the National Rifle Association is an interest group. The National Organization of Women, also known as NOW, is an interest group. There are thousands of interest groups, but anytime a group of people get together to try to influence government opinion, that is an interest group. We're going to go ahead. Here's the majoritarian model versus the pluralist model. In majoritarian model, the mass public controls the government. It relies on majority rules. You have to have cohesive political parties. In other words, political parties that stick together very well. And in the United States, our political parties are not very cohesive. You have to have a centralized government. England really is based upon this, the English system of government. You have the very powerful government in London, which is run by a parliament. Their political parties are very cohesive and stick together, and it's based on what the majority of the people want. It's very majoritarian. So that's a good example of a majoritarian model of government. That's not how we work. The pluralist model relies on the interests of specialized groups. In other words, everybody gets to have a voice. It limits majority action. You can't just do something. You have to, like, for instance, we have our Bill of Rights that limits what the government can do in certain situations. So it limits majority action. So even if the majority of the country wanted to name the Catholic Church as the state church of the United States, we can't do that because it's unconstitutional. It limits the majority action. And it has a decentralized government, like I said earlier. An undemocratic model would be the elite theory, which is where a small group makes most important decisions. You see that being accused by a lot, especially with Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are popular Democratic socialists, and they say that really our government's run by large business people and the big business interest of Wall Street, and they would say that we have an elite model, not really a majoritarian or a pluralist. And so that's kind of an accusation that is often thrown out there, but it's not the way ours would be set up, really. The two models of democratic government: majoritarian is representative government. No government achieves the responsiveness demanded. In a pluralist model, you have respond to minority interests, where no government offers equal access to all competing groups. There are kind of some problems there. There is no consensus among political scientists on which is preferable. My preference, personally, is the pluralist model because I believe it gives everyone the biggest voice in government and what's going on. Now, talking about the global challenge of democratization, it's difficult. One of the things that our country has tried to do in the last 20 years is to help other countries become more democratic. There are some problems with that because some governments meet the criteria of democracies, others do not. There are differences in the definition of what defines a democracy. There's actually been a slight decline in democracies in recent years. A few years back, there was what we call the Arab Spring, which is where a lot of people in Arab countries began to revolt against their authoritarian or totalitarian governments to establish more democratic governments, and it did not succeed. There are ethnic and religious conflicts, such as in Iraq, where you have three ethnic groups, the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis, who struggle for control of the government, and it's been very challenging to bring democracy there because they don't trust each other, etc. So that's been a problem. It's vulnerable to attack by opponents as in that process, and nations need democratization to succeed economically. In order to be successful economically, they need to be more democratic, but it's just difficult to make that happen in some countries, in some parts of the world. Many people don't have a background in it like the United States. You know, we go all the way back to the Magna Carta of 1215 in becoming a more democratic society. So it took hundreds of years for us to get to the place where we are. And not all people have that long history in democracy. So that's another reason why it would be challenging to establish a democracy in some places in the world. Our democracy is more pluralist than majoritarian. The principal drawback of pluralism is it favors the well-organized, so the affluent receive more benefits. In other words, if you've got a good organization and you're probably going to get more benefits than an organization that's not well organized or well funded. Recently, our parties are more sharply divided, making the U.S. system more majoritarian than it has been. We also see that people's trust in the American government has fallen in past years, so that has been a drawback to our pluralist type of government as well. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop there. Hope you have a good day.